When was the last time you heard an African leader speak fearlessly to the world, not for power, not for personal gain, but for dignity? In a time when most leaders read carefully written speeches tailored for Western approval, one young man from a small West African nation has chosen to stand alone. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier-turned-statesman from Burkina Faso, a country that until recently many in the world barely remembered existed. But in September 2022, the world remembered. Traoré, just 34 years old, led a coup that changed everything. The images spread like wildfire, crowds waving national flags, soldiers chanting his name, and young people calling him Africa's new hope. Some even compared him to Thomas Sankara, the beloved revolutionary of the 1980s, who once promised to make Burkina Faso a beacon for the black world. The echoes are haunting. Sankara spoke of independence, self-reliance, and dignity, and he was killed for it. Now, 4 decades later, another soldier rises with similar words on his lips, but in a world far more complex and divided. Burkina Faso's story is not just about a country breaking away from France. It is about a generation reclaiming its voice. Traoré calls it a battle for mental decolonization to stop dancing every time the imperial powers pull the strings. He challenges the very idea that Africa must always be guided, protected, or disciplined by outsiders. And so the question today is not whether Traoré will succeed. The question is deeper, more unsettling. Could this be the rebirth of Africa's true independence, or the beginning of another dangerous illusion? For millions across Africa, and for those of us who remember past revolutions, promises, and betrayals, this moment feels both familiar and frightening. Burkina Faso is once again standing at the crossroads of history, and the world is watching. In late September 2022, a wave of unrest swept through Ouagadougou. The distant crackle of gunfire echoed across the dusty streets, and people instinctively understood that something irreversible was happening. Within hours, the government that had long promised safety but failed to deliver was gone. The young officer who emerged from the turmoil was Ibrahim Traoré, barely in his mid-30s, quiet, measured, and steady in demeanor. For years, Burkina Faso had been trapped in a cycle of insecurity. Villages were burned, roads were unsafe, and families in rural areas had lived under constant threat of insurgent attacks. French troops had been present for nearly a decade, their bases scattered across the Sahel under the banner of counterterrorism. Yet, the violence only deepened. In the eyes of ordinary Burkinabe citizens, foreign soldiers came to symbolize not protection, but paralysis. By the time Traoré took power, public patience had already worn thin. The people no longer believed in distant promises made in Paris or in the endless declarations of cooperation. To them, the French presence had become an extension of the same colonial logic that had once governed their ancestors, a relationship that never truly ended, only changed form. So when the new leader moved to end that partnership, the decision struck a powerful chord. Across markets and villages, people spoke of renewal. In the capital, murals began to appear, showing the young soldier beside the face of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary whose short-lived dream of African self-reliance had been silenced decades earlier. The parallel was unavoidable. Both men had risen in moments of despair. Both carried the same conviction that Africa must define its own destiny. Early 2023 marked the beginning of what many came to call Africa's Frexit. In a single announcement, Burkina Faso demanded the withdrawal of all French forces from its soil. Within months, neighboring Mali and Niger followed. The Sahel, once the heart of France's counterterrorism network, suddenly became a zone of defiance. What had been considered a stable alliance for decades was crumbling in real time. In Paris, the reaction was one of disbelief. For many in the West, this shift appeared rash, even self-destructive. Analysts warned of a security vacuum predicting chaos and renewed insurgency. But inside Burkina Faso, the mood was entirely different. It was not chaos that people felt, it was a sense of long-awaited release. Street gatherings turned into celebrations. The flag of Burkina Faso fluttered beside those of Mali and Niger as citizens declared solidarity with their Sahelian neighbors. The movement was no longer just about France. It had become a statement of collective will that Africa, after decades of dependency and patronizing aid, could finally begin to stand alone. Still, the road ahead was uncertain. The loss of Western military support and funding presented enormous risks. Burkina Faso remained landlocked and economically fragile with vast regions under threat. Yet, amid the hardship, there was a new kind of determination spreading across the population, a belief that even if the journey was harder, it would at least be their own. Observers began to describe this moment as a second independence. The first one in the 1960s had brought flags and anthems, but little real sovereignty. This one, led not by politicians in suits, but by soldiers in fatigues, sought to reclaim the deeper idea of freedom, control over resources, decisions, and identity. As months passed, the atmosphere in Ouagadougou changed. Radio programs spoke about national pride and responsibility. Public murals bore slogans about unity and work. Across the Sahel, the notion of self-reliance began to resurface in political debates and everyday conversation. But for every sign of pride, there was also quiet anxiety. Could a small nation cut off from old allies truly chart a new course? Would new partnerships simply replace the old dependencies under different flags? Those questions lingered like dust over the red earth of Burkina Faso. Still, in the eyes of many Africans, young and old, the country had done something extraordinary. It had challenged the established order, confronted the legacy of colonial power, and dared to imagine a different future. Whether it would succeed or fail, Burkina Faso had already changed the conversation. The African Union Summit in Addis Ababa was supposed to be a celebration of diplomacy, a place where leaders exchanged polite speeches about cooperation, stability, and progress. But that year, the atmosphere was different. The war in Ukraine had divided the world, the Sahel was in turmoil, and Africa was no longer willing to play the role of a quiet observer. When Ibrahim Traoré arrived at the summit, he was still considered an outsider among seasoned heads of state. Many saw him as the face of rebellion, a symbol of a generation unwilling to bow to traditional hierarchies. Yet as he took his seat among monarchs and presidents, he carried with him a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle the room. The tension came to a head during a discussion on faith and governance. Delegates from the Arab world spoke at length about unity under Islamic leadership and the need to return to traditional structures. It was the kind of rhetoric that had echoed for decades across global conferences, ceremonial, predictable, and untouched by the pain of those who lived under its shadow. Then the atmosphere shifted. The young leader from Burkina Faso began to speak. He did not raise his voice, but the weight of his words could be felt through the hall. He spoke not as a theologian, but as a man who had seen faith distorted and used as a tool for control. He described how ordinary Africans prayed in mosques that crumbled from neglect, while immense wealth was poured into glittering towers abroad. He questioned the kind of leadership that preached equality, but lived in luxury, the kind that turned pilgrimage into privilege. As his words unfolded, the grand chamber of the African Union grew silent. The audience, made up of diplomats and clerics, shifted uneasily in their seats. What they were hearing was not a debate about religion, it was a challenge to a global hierarchy built on prestige, money, and inherited authority. For a brief, uncomfortable moment, It felt as though the young captain had pulled back the curtain on the moral contradictions of an entire system. The cameras caught the expressions of delegates, some shocked, others quietly approving. No one had ever heard a head of state from sub-Saharan Africa confront such powerful institutions so directly, especially on matters of faith. Yet Traoré's challenge was not about defiance for its own sake. In his mind, faith was inseparable from justice. The defense of the homeland, the dignity of the poor, and the struggle for equality were to him sacred responsibilities. He was redefining religion not as a ritual, but as a moral contract between people and their land. This vision resonated deeply in a region where extremist groups had long used distorted religious rhetoric to justify violence. Traoré's words, though political, offered a different path, one that linked spirituality to citizenship and duty to defense. He framed patriotism as a moral act, not merely a political stance. Back in Burkina Faso, this message took root quickly. Imams, community leaders, and youth movements began discussing what they called the moral awakening. Radio programs replayed excerpts from his speech, interpreting it as a call to reclaim the purity of belief from those who had commercialized it. For many, it was the first time they had heard an African leader speak of Islam not as a dogma imported from abroad, but as a lived faith shaped by the soil and struggles of their own people. Out of this vision emerged the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland. Local militias made up of farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers who saw the protection of their communities as both a civic and spiritual duty. Across the countryside, people joined not because of money or ideology, but out of conviction that defending their homes was an act of faith itself. To observers abroad, it was a surprising fusion of religion and nationalism. But to the people of Burkina Faso, it felt natural, as though the two had always been connected. The confrontation in Addis Ababa had been more than a diplomatic moment. It had exposed a deep divide between those who saw faith as power and those who saw it as purpose. Ibrahim Traoré's challenge to the established guardians of Islam was not an act of rebellion alone. It was a quiet declaration that Africa too had the right to interpret its own soul. When France's final military convoy left Burkina Faso in early 2023, the dust it raised hung in the air like a symbol of an era ending. The French tricolor that had long fluttered over Sahelian bases disappeared, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the country had truly reclaimed its land. But as one chapter closed, another began, one written in Cyrillic letters. Burkina Faso's leadership turned toward Moscow almost immediately. The young government sought new partners who would treat it not as a subject, but as an equal. Russia, eager to expand its footprint in Africa, responded with open arms. The relationship grew quickly, accelerated by shared political narratives. Both nations spoke of sovereignty, resistance to Western dominance, and mutual respect. In the months that followed, Russian planes began landing at Ouagadougou's international airport under tight security. Officially, they brought military trainers and technical assistance. But on the ground, everyone knew it was more than that. The group once known as Wagner, now rebranded as Africa Corps, was taking position in Burkina Faso. Their presence was discreet, but visible convoys moving through the countryside, Russian advisors working alongside Burkinabe officers, translators, learning local dialects. For the people, this shift was both thrilling and unsettling. After decades under French tutelage, the sudden appearance of a new foreign force stirred mixed emotions. Some saw it as liberation proof that Burkina Faso was no longer under Western command. Others, more cautious, whispered that freedom could easily be traded for another kind of dependence. The arrangement was practical, almost transactional. Burkina Faso, rich in gold, offered access to mining concessions in exchange for training, arms, and protection. It was a simple equation, gold for security. But beneath that simplicity lay an uncomfortable question: how long could such a deal last before sovereignty became currency? Traoré's administration framed the partnership as a pragmatic necessity. The country was surrounded by conflict and had few allies left. Russia provided what the West had refused: weapons, without lectures support, without political conditions. For a nation weary of moral sermons from Paris and Washington, this new approach felt refreshing, almost dignified. Yet in the quiet corners of the capital, diplomats and analysts voiced concern. They spoke of Moscow's growing influence across the Sahel from Bamako to Niamey, and wondered whether the region was trading one empire for another. The same pattern appeared everywhere: military cooperation, mining rights, and media campaigns praising the new friendship. In 2025, Traoré traveled to Moscow to attend the World War II victory parade. Cameras captured him standing among global leaders, watching the soldiers march past Red Square. It was a symbolic moment. Burkina Faso, once a colony of France, now aligning itself with the heirs of the Soviet Union. For some, it was the visual proof of Africa's new independence. For others, it was a quiet warning that independence could easily be redefined. Back home, the streets of Ouagadougou filled with murals showing Traoré beside Russian symbols, painted by youth movements eager to celebrate the country's newfound strength. In public squares, people spoke of Russia as a true ally, one that respected African sovereignty. But in private conversations, older citizens remembered the past too well: how easily powerful nations could cloak ambition in the language of friendship. The new alliance changed the balance of power in the Sahel. Western nations, particularly the United States and France, viewed it with growing unease. Reports surfaced suggesting that Russian forces were guarding key gold sites and advising on political security. The West condemned the arrangement, warning that Russia was exploiting Africa's instability. But those warnings came too late. They sounded more like echoes of a fading empire than genuine concern. For Burkina Faso, the Russian partnership brought short-term stability but long-term uncertainty. The insurgencies slowed but did not disappear. The economy gained cash flow, but the state's dependence on mining revenue deepened. And while Traoré's rhetoric of self-reliance inspired millions, the practical realities of governance told a different story. In the eyes of many Africans, this pivot was still a victory, proof that the continent could choose its allies freely. But in the broader view of history, it also revealed the enduring struggle of post-colonial nations to seek autonomy in a world where every path to freedom leads through someone else's gate. Burkina Faso stood proud, but the question lingered, whispered across café tables and radio airwaves: had the nation finally broken free, or simply changed the language of its dependence? In Western capitals, the news from Ouagadougou was received with disbelief, then irritation. Burkina Faso, a small landlocked country that had rarely made global headlines, was suddenly at the center of every foreign policy discussion. For decades, the Sahel had been treated as a security outpost, a place where France and the United States could project power under the banner of stability. Now that arrangement was collapsing. In Paris, officials spoke of betrayal. For years, France had justified its presence in Africa as a moral duty, a continuation of the old partnerships forged after independence. Yet, when the people of Burkina Faso celebrated the departure of French troops, waving homemade signs and chanting for sovereignty, those partnerships began to look more like chains. The symbolism was painful. The empire that once ruled half of Africa was being told to pack up and leave. In Washington, reactions were more cautious. Analysts spoke of strategic realignments and geopolitical competition, phrases that softened what many feared: that the West was losing ground in a region it had long taken for granted. The growing influence of Russia, and to a lesser extent China, gave the situation a Cold War undertone. To American observers, the Sahel was no longer just about terrorism or poverty. It had become the newest arena in the global contest for influence. The European Union issued statements calling for stability, democracy, and human rights. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, such phrases sounded hollow. After years of broken promises and selective concern, few believed that Western governments were motivated by principle. To many Africans, the outrage in Europe seemed less about values and more about lost control. French media revisited the old term France-Afrique, that uneasy blend of influence and dependency that had defined Paris's relationship with its former colonies. Commentators recalled how African soldiers had once fought and died for France during the World Wars, only to return home to half pensions and forgotten names. The historical echoes were difficult to ignore: the imbalance, the unspoken hierarchy, the presumption that gratitude should last forever. As months passed, the tone of Western commentary shifted from outrage to resignation. France withdrew its remaining personnel, and the United States quietly scaled back its regional programs. Burkina Faso's defiance had become more than a political act. It was a mirror held up to the old world order, reflecting both its arrogance and its fatigue. For older generations watching from afar, Americans who remembered the decolonization struggles of the 1960s, it was a reminder of how history never really ends. The faces change, the flags change, but the questions remain the same: who truly governs, and at what cost? As the sun rises over the Sahel, its light spreads across a land still marked by scars, villages once emptied by war roads, once patrolled by foreign troops, and hearts once heavy with silence. Today, those same places breathe again, uncertain yet awake. In Burkina Faso, the feeling is not triumph, but renewal, fragile, unfinished, and deeply human. Ibrahim Traoré's journey has never been just about politics. It has been about reclaiming the meaning of dignity for a continent that has been told time and again to wait for permission to rise. His choices: the break with France, the embrace of Russia, the call for moral and spiritual integrity, have reshaped how Africa speaks to itself and to the world. Yet every act of liberation carries its own burden. The price of freedom is never paid once. It is a lifelong debt to vigilance. Burkina Faso may have expelled its old masters, but now it must guard against the seduction of new patrons. True independence is not written in declarations or alliances. It is built slowly in the way people govern themselves, feed their children, and defend their soil. For those watching from afar, especially from the comfort of stable nations, the story of Burkina Faso may seem distant, but it speaks to something universal: the yearning to be heard, to stand without leaning, to live without asking. It reminds us that history moves not only through empires and summits, but through the quiet courage of ordinary people who decide that enough is finally enough. As Africa reclaims its voice, the world faces a choice: to listen or to repeat the mistakes of the past. The awakening of one nation may soon echo across an entire continent. And perhaps, when we look back, we will see that the spark of this awakening began in a small landlocked country called Burkina Faso, guided by a soldier who dared to speak differently. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than headlines. Because the story of Africa is no longer just Africa's story, it is the story of a world deciding what freedom truly means.